Welcome, DJ Ryan Fresh, everybody. Amazing mix. Again, you can find him, DJ Ryan Fresh. Please book him for all your events. He's been a fabulous DJ tonight. Saying hello, I'm Sora. I work here at MOHAI, and I'm very excited to have you all here this evening for the Curator's Fellowship, Reframing Seattle's Southeast Asian Histories. As an important welcome to our space, we encourage you to take care of your needs. If you'd like to use the restroom at any point during this event, it's just past the Ichiro Tower and to the left down the hallway. There is a bar in the back, a cash bar with some snacks and beverages available until 8 p.m. A little run of show tonight. We'll start with a presentation from our Curator's Fellow, Thanh, and then we'll follow that with some breakout groups and discussion time. If you'd like to preview some of the questions, I'll ask you to also maybe get together in some bigger groups later when the time comes. And then following those discussion groups, we'll have a brief Q&A, and then that'll be the show. And if at any point you would also like to check out some tabling from our lovely friends at the Wing Luke Museum, they're in the back by the Wawona there. Hey, they're waving. Oh, so great. And then there's also a display in the back with some supplemental photos from MOHAI's collection if you'd like to check those out as well. Since tonight's theme will be talking about immigration and refugees, it's important to acknowledge that here at MOHAI, we are on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place with lasting impact on the land, water, and people. Therefore, it's crucial that we hold deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes and their cultural centers to learn more about the people whose land we're on. Today, we will be hearing from Thanh, our fourth Curator's Fellow. The Curator's Fellowship is a MOHAI program that invites community and academic historians to bring a new perspective to MOHAI's extensive collections and then share those findings with the public. Thanh has spent the last few months working with MOHAI's collections to elucidate histories from the early resettlement years of Southeast Asian immigrants and refugees in the Seattle area following the Vietnam War. Before I turn over the mic, just a little bit more about Thanh. Thanh is an award-winning multimedia storyteller based in Seattle. Her work has been published in local and national media, including KUOW, KCTS, This American Life, and the New York Times. Creator of the Second Wave podcast, Thanh has also produced documentaries, founded Viet Fact Check, and archived South Vietnamese ephemera. Please give her a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Okay. So I have been told many, many times over the last, actually my entire life, that I talk way too fast. So I'm gonna try to help out our interpreter, our captioner, by slowing down my pace. I'm so excited to be here with all of you on what is probably the most heartbreaking day in the city of Seattle. For any of us who were watching the Mariners game last night, I am heartbroken with you, but we will get through this. My presentation today, I'm gonna speak for a little bit, but as I am talking today, I want you all to also think about how everything that I'm bringing up is also accessible to you and to others in our community. And this might seem like sort of a one-way conversation. I'm gonna share my findings with you, but I also invite community to think about the ways that you can go into the archive and help to fill in some of these holes in our narratives. And at the end, during the Q&A, if you have questions about how you can do that and be a part of this community archive, Anna and from the museum and other staff members are here and will be ready to answer any questions to help to guide you in your journey to be a citizen curator like me. So, okay, we ready? Everybody's sitting where they want to sit. It's a cozy audience tonight, you know? So if anybody wants to move, come closer, you are so welcome to do that. Okay. Good evening, everyone. As you know, I'm Thanh, and over the past few months, I've had the privilege of serving as MOHAI's Curator's Fellow, exploring how this museum and primarily our local newspapers have documented and sometimes unintentionally overlooked the histories of Southeast Asian refugees in Seattle. Tonight is not just a lecture, it's a conversation about memory, about what the archive preserves, what it distorts, and possibly what's missing entirely. The images that you'll see tonight, many of them are pulled from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer collection at MOHAI. This collection, as you'll see, they have captured extraordinary moments of arrival, adaptation, and resilience, but they also reveal how easily stories can be flattened or sometimes forgotten altogether. My hope is that you will see yourselves, your families, or your neighbors reflected here, and perhaps recognize where the record still needs your voice. Before we begin, I just have a few caveats. First of all, were any of you here for my February talk on Hidden Echoes of Vietnam in Seattle? I just want to know, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but okay, all right. So a few caveats that I shared then and I'll share again now. I am not a refugee. I'm actually not an immigrant either. I am a citizen, archivist, and curator. I was born in Olympia, Washington, to Vietnamese parents who rebuilt their lives here after the fall of Saigon in 1975. I inherited their memories, but I also inherited the privilege of time and stability to examine them. The Vietnam War's legacy reaches far beyond Vietnam, though. It reshaped the lives of others throughout Southeast Asia, Cambodians, the Lao, the Hmong, many of whom also made Washington State their home. And so I'm attempting tonight to not just talk about the Vietnamese experience that I have lived and witnessed, but also to expand and remind us that Southeast Asian means more than Vietnam, and the Vietnam War means more than just the Vietnamese people who were impacted. My work is not to debate ideology or to relive trauma. It's to rehumanize the people reduced to headlines or stereotypes and to ask how our institutions can represent us more fully. This fellowship, in my eyes, is just a beginning. MOHAI, and I've been told I can say this, but is tentatively planning, we really hope, that we'll be able to expand this research into an exhibit next year, built collaboratively with community members, and perhaps including some of you in this room. The question that I want everyone to think about in a sub-question is, 50 years after the Vietnam War, what do we remember? And also, what have we forgotten? My personal mission in doing this research was to go beyond the talk that I gave in February, which is on YouTube, about the hidden echoes of Vietnam in Seattle, and to explore the interconnected histories of Southeast Asian communities in the region during their formative years of resettlement from the late 1970s through the 1990s. My primary sources here were all of the collection of ephemera, artifacts, photos in the MOHAI archives, which is actually located. They have a beautiful museum here, but if you did not know, there is also an incredible hidden resource center out in the middle of Georgetown, that neighborhood in Seattle. And I had the pleasure of being able to go out there and having Anna and team help me and bringing out all these folders of just what were just beautiful photos. And these were photo prints that were donated to the museum from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And in addition to what I found in the archives, which is print photos as well as negatives, film strips, there was a lot of missing information. And so I took a lot of pictures of the front of these photos, but also the back of these photos, where the PI staff had taped on there captions for the photos and other context. Who was the photojournalist who took the photo? Who was the reporter? What was the date? And so I was able to use that information to go into the Seattle Public Library, shout out to our libraries, which has an online archive of all of the Seattle PI's prior newspapers. And so by using that, I was able to recontextualize and just kind of understand what were some of the stories that were being covered that these photographs were used for. Today I'm going to talk about in 3 acts. Act 1 is framing the war and sharing with you some observations and findings in the archives. The first set of artifacts ephemera that I looked at was actually a bunch of political posters. And Anna can tell us later, I forget the name of who donated this collection. But we laid them all out on the table, and one by one, I looked at this just to see what were they protesting? What was the environment? What was the political dialogue happening here in Washington State, primarily in Seattle and King County, in the last days of the Vietnam War, which, if you don't know, the war ended April 30th, 1975. And the US officially got involved in 1965. So we're talking 10 years of conflict, tens of thousands of Americans who died serving in that war. But we're also talking about Cold War context. And so we're talking about even years before that of secret intervention and involvement. And so the Vietnam War stretches actually many years, but what was the dialogue and what was happening here in the United States? And these posters were actually more insightful than I expected because it gives you a sense of how anti-war many people were here in Seattle. A lot of that coming from the University of Washington and also local, very progressive socialist labor groups. And let me try to make this bigger so that I can see it. But and I'd be very interested in trying to understand what were people talking about? And let's see here, I'm having a hard time seeing my notes. So what we see on the upper left-hand side, implement the peace agreements, end all aid to Tew and Lon Nol, demonstrate Saturday, February 1st. So this tells you, it's interesting because I was like, oh, did people think that all Vietnamese people were sort of a monolith and against this war? Like, did people think that all Vietnamese people were puppets? Because Tew was the South Vietnamese president. Lon Nol was the US-backed head of Cambodia at the time. So they were ostensibly pro-democracy, but the people here did not like those leaders. And that was, for me, as a child of someone who was in the South Vietnamese army, it made me see that, oh, people did not like the side that my family ostensibly was on. And I thought that was, interesting. Also, some of these other ads, Vietnam Eyewitness, the case for material aid, how Americans can help to heal the wounds of war in Indochina. 2 speakers speaking about their recent trips there. Not Vietnamese, Phyllis Bennis and Dr. Glenn Gordon. We see this political ad says, Indochina, still America's war. Americans are being asked to spend $11 million a day in Indochina. If we agree, every day an additional 4,000 Indochinese people will be killed, wounded, imprisoned, or made refugees. We see Vietnam, an eyewitness account. We see an ad down here for let's meet at the federal courthouse, and this is protesting withdrawal. And also Jane Fonda, Tom Hayden came to town, and they were also opposed to the Vietnam War, and some of us in the room may or may not remember Jane Fonda famously went to Vietnam, had access to the Northern Vietnamese Communist forces, was posing on their tanks, and this upset a lot of American veterans and the American US government because she was more or less taking the side of the Vietnamese communists at the time. Vietnam, An American Journey, so there were films that were being shown in community and people who wanted to be involved, and I understand why, like anti-war, I get it. because so many Americans were being asked to serve. And I thought that these were just interesting because, especially thinking about the times that we're living in now, we just had the No Kings protest, and I think that there's more room for exploration. And so I'd be very curious, who went to these rallies? What did they talk about? You know, when you look back on this, 50 years have gone by. Do the protesters feel the same way about the cause that they were advocating for or against? Some more ads. The imagery here, this is kind of a famous, popular image of what the Viet Cong, like the Vietnamese who were not for the South Vietnamese nationalist movement, who were pro-communist, that's sort of a famous look, you know, for them. And so we see that was an image that was being circulated here in the United States. Clearly people wanted to just stop the war. Frogs March, I kind of thought that reminded me of, like, you know, everybody's dressing up as animals right now and like at these places and protesting, you know, what the Trump administration's doing. There's a sign here that says US out of Southeast Asia, celebrate May Day, smash racism, which the irony is that I don't think anybody was being intentionally racist, but a lot of these ads, in my mind, again, assume that all the Vietnamese people wanted independence and freedom, which they did, but that it assumes that all Vietnamese people in Vietnam wanted to side with the communists, you know? So I thought that was interesting. The only peace plan for the Vietnamese people, this one on the lower left-hand side, 1, the US government must set a definite date for the total withdrawal from South Vietnam of all troops, advisors, military personnel, weapons, and war materials. 2, Nguyen Van Thieu must resign immediately, and the Saigon administration stop its oppressive, repressive machine. So this very much pulls into, it indicates that these protesters believed in this narrative that the government of South Vietnam, who the US was allied with, was so corrupt, so ineffective, that we needed them out. And I thought that was, clearly that's why US, by the end of the war, by April 75, US Congress did not want to provide any additional aid to South Vietnam to defend itself from the coming communist incursion. And this is just such a strongly worded, this is also an anti-war ad from the Revolutionary Union, and I just want to read, this is before the end of the war. They say, the press and TV are filled daily with dire predictions and unconfirmed reports of atrocities and bloodbaths, but everybody knows who was carrying out a bloodbath for the past 10 years, the US government and the Thieu and Lon Nol regimes financed by the United States. It was because the entire people of Vietnam and Cambodia, men, women, and children, united and fought for their freedom, that they were able to defeat the mightiest industrial power in the world. Now we are told that, having won their liberation, they want to carry out a bloodbath against themselves. So clearly, whoever organized this did not recognize or see the reality is that's exactly what ended up happening once the war ended. It's complicated, right? We got Thieu fell from power. Lon Nol fell from power. The Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia. The communists took over South Vietnam. But after that, that was the beginning of such a painful period for so many Vietnamese who did starve, who were sent to prison, who were not allowed to advance in life if you were affiliated or associated with the former South Vietnamese regime. There were circumstances that led millions of people to flee the country on boats, on land, on foot, and to seek shelter in neighboring countries, from Thailand to Indonesia to Malaysia to the Philippines to Hong Kong. So Southeast Asia, truly, it was burning. So it hurt my heart a little bit because it felt like this is such a diminishment of what the Vietnamese people were going through and an assumption that freedom meant that there was no violence, because it lacked a recognition that the Vietnam War was a civil war. The United States absolutely intervened, right or wrong, but it was also a civil war among Vietnamese who had different ideas of what kind of government they wanted to live with. So then comes 1975, April, and the first major resettlement headline that we start to see in the news is Operation Baby Lift. And this is when we see, even before the fall of Saigon, in the weeks leading up to it, hundreds of Vietnamese orphans are airlifted out as Saigon is falling. And in these images, we see these are the babies that were arriving, and these are local Seattle, Washington residents who showed up at the airport to adopt these babies, to take care of them, and to pick them up. Clearly, there was an effort from the president on down to the governor of Washington saying at that time, early April, no one knew what was going to happen, but saying let's provide safe passage for some of the most innocent victims of war. And it's very moving because the collection has pictures of just crowded. SeaTac was so crowded, and there are photos of people, who very much wanted children. And this was the opportunity for them to be parents, was to adopt these children. But as we now know, many of these children were not, in fact, orphans. They were people who had parents in Vietnam who found a way to just get them on those planes. So the Operation Baby Lift babies, many of them, they're on their own journey now to organize and to try to really understand the origins of their story. Even though it was something it was such a heartfelt gesture, and it was a truly humanitarian gesture, but it was not what exactly what it seemed at the time, and how it was billed to the public as we're gonna rescue the babies and the kids. So then in the coming months, we start to see local coverage in the newspaper about who these children are. So this little boy, I saw this photo in the archive, and he's jumping for joy. And his name is Le Quoc Tun, and very quickly he tells the media, call me Bobby. And he is here alone. And he has been adopted by an American, a white family here in the Washington area. And he's renamed himself, and he's told the reporter that he wants to be a pilot so that he can go back, see his mother again, and fight the communists. He literally says, so I can kill the communists. But what we see here is, notice the headline, Orphan Tuấn 9 leaps for joy. Like, he's so happy to be here in America. And this is the first introduction that our community has. More and more coverage tailor-made to really build compassion, right? Which is not a bad thing, but we see how these children are adjusting to life. They're having to learn a new language. They are meeting sponsors. They are being cradled and loved for by, again, families that really were so excited to be parents. But these are also children, the two little boys on the right, they're looking at a photo of their family that is left behind in Vietnam. And very clearly you can tell through their expressions that they're missing their families. And so what we see is innocence, we see voicelessness, and we see images of rescue, which does stir compassion, but it also starts to define the Vietnamese people through this lens of tragedy and victimhood. So because there was a photo that came up in the collection that really caught my eye, and I did share it back in February, but I also wanted to do some research into the archives to find out what were the origins of that story. And as it turns out, on April 30th, 1975, the Seattle PI had this story: 65 South Viet orphans fly into McChord Air Force Base. So aside from the Operation Baby Lift that had happened earlier in the month at SeaTac, we also know that there were babies. There was another plane load of children that were sent to McChord Air Force Base. And to the left of this headline, which again features cute, happy kids, so happy to be rescued and to be in America, right? So this is the story that is on the left in tiny print. And the story says, Trung An Thu, one of the Vietnamese orphans brought here from Saigon April 5th, died early yesterday at Children's Orthopedic Hospital of pneumonia and complications. The baby girl, about 6 months old, had been suffering from malnutrition as well as an unusual type of pneumonia. She just gradually went downhill, a hospital spokesperson said. The infant had been in the intensive care unit for more than a week. Only one of the original 15 Vietnamese infants who were hospitalized here on their arrival from Seattle remain at Children's Orthopedic Hospital. She is a 4-month-old girl in critical condition in the intensive care unit, suffering from pneumonia, the hospital said. Trung An Thu will be buried in a donated lot at Acacia Cemetery in graveside services at 1 p.m. tomorrow. And a couple days later, on May 2nd, 1975, we see this. This is the photo in the archive that caught my eye. And this is the original caption. Says, a circle of mourners at Acacia Memorial Park yesterday said goodbye to Trung An Thu, the 6-month-old Vietnamese orphan who died Tuesday at Children's Orthopedic Hospital of pneumonia. She arrived less than a month ago aboard a Mercy flight from Saigon. She may be one of the last victims of the Vietnam War. Robert Chamness, director of Holt Children's Services, and his father, the Reverend Vaughn Chamness, presided at the service. Photo by Howard Staples. And this is the photo. And it just, all sorts of questions, came to my mind. I'm like, what a beautiful moment. And I'm so happy I'm so grateful that I don't know who all these people are, but I'm so grateful that they showed up at the service for this baby who made it to the US, but didn't survive. And that tiny little coffin, it made me wonder, has anybody visited this gravesite over the last 50 years? And this child is more or less forgotten to history, if not for the fact that there is a photo of her funeral in the newspaper, and I happen to be a curator's fellow who got to look at it. And I just feel lucky to know that there was a little girl named Trung An Thu who was able to make it, was here in Seattle, Washington for just a short amount of time, but she's remembered. And there are other photos in the archive of a child in an incubator, but I can't tell which baby it is, because there were so many babies in the ICU. But also, to think about that this is the power of our local newspapers. This is why we need to have, even if they didn't always get it right, it's so important to have a record of these events that are happening in our community. And there is a need for us to scour the archives, because there are valuable, important stories. And to think these photos were almost thrown away. If the Seattle PI did not donate this collection to MOHAI, we may not know any of these stories. And so I encourage us all to think about what is absent in these frames. And also note that we're hearing about the children, but there's also the adults who no one here realizes is going to be coming to Washington State in the days after. I think people thought the war is over. So soldiers, teachers, mothers, these are the people who would quietly come here and rebuild this region, and their story begins next. Act 2, arriving in a new world. So when Saigon fell in 1975, the story didn't end, it landed here in America. And families were evacuated, about 130,000 were evacuated in the final days of US involvement in the war, and taken to military bases around the country. Primarily, there was one in Indiantown Gap, there was one at Camp Pendleton, and there was one in Arkansas. And they put up tents and more or less housed these refugees. And the image here on the left is a former and the late Secretary of State Ralph Monroe, who was sent by then Governor Dan Evans a Republican, to go down to Camp Pendleton and to take a look at what was going on, because we had heard in the news that Governor Jerry Brown at the time, Democrat of California, did not want these refugees to land in California because there was a concern these people are going to come, they're going to take jobs, and we're not prepared and we're not ready for them. But they did land, and at Camp Pendleton, they erected, as you can see, a ton of tents down there. So Ralph flew down there as a special aide to the governor just to observe and to bear witness, and came back, wrote up a report, and was very moved by what he saw, because he felt, what I see are people who have some valuable skills that we may want, here in Washington state, and we should welcome them. And so without his observations and his advocacy, and Governor Evans' willingness to pull together mutual aid, emergency calling on Washingtonians, on communities to come together to welcome refugees, I might not be here today. This is a letter. This is Governor Evans at the time announcing and encouraging Washingtonians to get involved in the effort. This was around May 8th, is when he announced that Washington was going to open its doors to 500 of the Vietnamese refugees who had arrived at Camp Pendleton. And this is a look at the message board in the camp, where I imagine the letter from Washington State inviting them in English and in Vietnamese to come up here to Washington to resettle. This is probably where they saw that. And it was people selected at random who, many of them thought it was Washington, like the other Washington, D.C. They didn't realize it was Washington State. They didn't realize that they were going from tropical weather, to Washington State's weather. But 500 people did come. And at that time, Camp Murray was transformed into the Vietnamese Assistance Center. So they turned barracks into temporary homes for the Vietnamese refugees, the first 500 who came here to the state. And through the archive, I also learned there was another camp in Cheney, Washington, and I didn't realize that. So they would come to these places, and then sponsors, individuals, churches would come and sponsor these families and literally say, we will help and show them the way, help them find homes, help them find jobs, help to give them clothes, and get them whatever aid we can temporarily so that they can get on their feet. One of the first families that was photographed in the newspapers is this family. And on the far right, his name is Duong Binh, or Binh Duong. And he was an officer in the South Vietnamese military. And this is his family. And we posted this on Instagram, on socials. And I looked at this and I'm like, I feel like I recognize this person. And as it turns out, he's one of our elders in the Vietnamese community in Olympia, Washington. Who went on to became an interpreter, worked for DSHS to ensure that refugees had resources, and he raised his family in Olympia, Washington. And Sung recognized, he saw on social, and his daughter, so the granddaughter and the dad are like, that's our family. And so they reached out to MOHAI, and MOHAI was like, get in touch with us, we want to learn more, because they're always filling in the blanks of who are these people who largely remained nameless in stories. We see smiling refugees, but we don't, and we know they're grateful, but we don't really see beyond that. But, it just is an indication. So this is the first time in 1975 that Washingtonians meet these Vietnamese families. And we start to see stories like this. Welcome to America. Now smile for the camera. Which is also a little patronizing. It's like, you're here, you should be happy and grateful. Which, who likes to be told you need to be happy and grateful? No one likes to say that, but it's not as if these families could express anything else. And so that's a photo of, on the right, that's Governor Dan Evans, shaking the hands of a gentleman and his son. And then on the bottom is one of the first refugees with his sponsor, who's holding his child. And he is trying to think of ways to get the rest of his family over. Because for so many of these families, they were separated from their loved ones. So it was coming here, and before they could even take care of themselves, they're already thinking, how do I get my wife, my mother, my father, my children here? Because they are in Vietnam and they're not safe. And I should also note that some of these come from the Washington State Archive, not just the MOHAI archive. So there may be some overlap. Again, you see Duc Mai was the New Land newspaper, the very first Vietnamese language newspaper in the United States that was funded by the state of Washington, and ran for several years and became a lifeline. People from other states would subscribe to Washington's Duc Mai because they would have stories of things they were hearing from the homeland, families that had resettled in Washington and they were looking for somebody who they think may have been in Indiana. And so the Vietnamese community is hungry for information across the United States. And so this newspaper becomes the first sort of lifeline to information. And you see a family leaving Camp Murray. They look really happy. They're with a sponsor family. And then on the right, these are images in the archive of what happened after 1975 and in the years following. They start to try to rebuild their lives. The gentleman on top, this is Bin Huynh, who is holding up a certificate from ACRS, Asian Counseling and Referral Service, which is helping all these refugees. And he's holding up a certificate because he is now a certified custodian. And so he's anxious to find that first job, and he's willing to clean. And I think he's someone who had like a business in Vietnam, but fled the country. And so now here he is, and he's excited to become self-sufficient. On the bottom left, this gentleman is a former soldier and is desperate to start making money somehow so that he can get more schooling, according to the caption that I read. And here he is, he became a custodian a janitor for the Seattle City Light. And on the bottom right is a woman holding her two sons, and this is them at Camp Murray getting processed after being at Camp Pendleton. And I think what's interesting about that image of the woman and her two children is I thought I recognized the face of the child. I don't know why. I was like, who is this? Well, as it turns out, that is Thach Nguyen, who is a very well-known developer, very successful. He's proud millionaire, like here in Seattle. And so we see how he's covered in 1975 as a little boy. And then we see in 2003, this is actually a Seattle Times story that was in the Seattle PI archive. And it's a success story. And it's like, look at this American dreamer. He went from being rescue to now being the rescuer, because he is now creating homes for people who are less fortunate. And there are photos of him with his mother, and the headline, American Dreamer. Almost 30 years ago, this Vietnamese refugee came to the area and lived in temporary housing. Today, he is creating homes for families in need. An immigrant and inspiration, which is all true. And we love these kind of stories. We love full circle stories. I love full circle stories. As somebody who's been a journalist and as somebody who's been a communicator in PR, these are the stories that our news organizations really gravitate to. And it's so easy to make the connection. But I think that what is missing is what happened in between. And the journey to get from here to there is not always black and white. But this is the type of story that, quite frankly, many of our Vietnamese community members, we only want these kind of stories. We're very proud, and we want these kind of stories. We don't want stories about the negative things happening in our community. We don't want stories of struggle. We want people to see we are grateful to be in America, and we are giving back. And I think that's fine, but then we look at the current environment that we're in, and it is heartbreaking for me to see that there are many of the same people in our Vietnamese community who have forgotten that somebody helped us. And we're in an age right now where there are very vulnerable groups that need advocacy and need support and need help. And I'm gonna call out my own people for this, but we should be loud and we should be at the front lines arguing for giving people a shot and a chance to resettle and to find safety and refuge in America. And way too many of us are not. We're silent, either because we have fallen victim to this whole, we think we're the model minority, we're special, we just don't care, but for whatever reason, I really, it makes me sad, or we've forgotten, and I think that's really what it is. It's not intentional, we have just forgotten. the circumstances that were needed for us to be able to come here to Washington and to have the lives that we have today. And this is a photo of the news team, and I put this up, I think I showed this in February, and I just wanted to share that this is the community newspaper team, clearly looking really happy. This is in the late 70s, and where they're gathered is actually the Filipino Community Center here in the Seattle area, which just goes to show that it's like the Filipinos were here first, and they organized, and they had a place to call their own. And when the Vietnamese came, we didn't have a place to call our own. And we needed a place to be able to gather this information, run a newspaper, and it happened out of the Filipino Center, which was just a little bit of piece of history from the archive that I learned that I did not know before. And I think it's important for us to recognize the importance of supporting each other, of those who came before, have just a little more knowledge and more resources, and you gotta help those who come after you. And here are more photos of people that, being showcased and propped up in the newspaper. I shouldn't say propped up, that's the wrong word, that's a negative connotation. But these are individuals in the community who are rebuilding their lives, and the newspaper was there to document that. On the upper left-hand side, that's Vu Duc Vinh, who was a very high-ranking South Vietnamese government official who resettled here and became the very first editor of Duc Mai, the New Land newspaper, and also worked for DSHS and was a community leader. He has since passed away, but one of the most valuable possessions that I have in my own personal archive is a collection of his essays and writings and stories documenting the challenges, the good, the bad, and the ugly of those first few years for the Vietnamese refugee population here in Washington state. To the right is Da Le, who tried to open his own newspaper. And so what we see in those years is the Vietnamese are starting to find their voice. And as it turns out, they also have different editorial voices and different opinions. And Da Le was for normalizing relations with Vietnam in the 1980s and the 1990s. And that was very dangerous territory for him. So the story was featuring him in his office, but he says he's also getting threats from his own community because of this position that is unpopular among a lot of other Vietnamese who do not want to normalize relations. They want to beat the communists, they want the communists to go down in power, and they want retribution in some cases. And so for a newspaper publisher to have a different view than that was dangerous at the time. On the bottom left, we see this is a student who has just graduated from the University of Washington and is another one of our wonderful success stories of came as a child, 10 years later, look, graduating the top of their class at the University of Washington, gonna get a nice job. And then on the bottom right is a family that opened I don't know what the restaurant is called actually, but they opened a restaurant. And so there are photos of them inside their restaurant. And I'm very curious, who are they? How long were they around? Where are they today? I don't know. I don't know the whereabouts of any of these people except for Vu Duc Vinh, who passed away. And when I said that we're starting to find our political voice, there's quite a few undeveloped film strips as well, negatives in the collection. And perhaps someday it might be worth us trying to go in there and trying to see if we can find out more about these. But in this one, I don't know how easy it is. It's not that easy to read, but I picked this one and I took a picture of it on my iPhone because it's a child who is being taken out to a protest with their parents, which is a very common occurrence for me as a kid. My dad would take us to all of these demonstrations. I didn't understand, what it was. Usually it was something with human rights. In this case, this child is saying a free port for boat people. So the boat people are the people like my parents who fled Vietnam illegally, got into boats, were able to find safe refuge in one of these refugee camps in a neighboring country in Southeast Asia, and really needed safe refuge. And some of them came here to the United States. Some people went to France. Some people went to Australia. Some people went to Canada. Some people were repatriated, sent back to Vietnam. And some people stayed in these third countries. And to this day, we still have Vietnamese refugees who are in Thailand and in Philippines, and they're just sort of living in the outskirts of society, stateless. But even at the time, we see that the Vietnamese community on top of, again, being able to rebuild our lives, trying to advocate for those who are left behind. And one of the messages here is set free 800,000 political prisoners. And the people they're referring to there are America's former allies. So anyone who served with the South Vietnamese civil service, in the South Vietnamese military, was forced into concentration camp after the end of the war and imprisoned, many of them up until the early 1990s. And that was something that Americans probably didn't anticipate. No one anticipated that the retribution was going to be that bad, but it was. And so these refugees had to find a way to bring attention to it. So these protests would happen outside of federal buildings. My family in Olympia and our community would gather at the state capitol with our signs, with multi-generational families advocating for human rights. This is a photo in the exhibit that I didn't find online, but it shows a woman who left Vietnam in 1975, and she was reunited with her Amerasian daughter 24 years later. And so for those of us who may not know who the Amerasians are the children of American soldiers or foreign soldiers who were serving in Vietnam, and there was prostitution happening. There was some action going on, and tens of thousands of children were born. And in the late 1980s, through grassroots advocacy efforts, as the U.S. was trying to figure out what was happening and trying to find the remains of POWs, a part of that was opening up policy and allowing different groups of Vietnamese refugees to get special status and to be able to relocate to the United States. So Amerasians started in the 1980s. They started bringing these children here to the United States. And for some of them, some of them knew who their fathers were, and they would bring their father's picture with them and a name. Some of them did not know who their fathers were. But imagine there was this issue. Vietnamese newspapers were all over the country, and people were looking for their loved ones. They were looking for their fathers. And imagine a lot of these American soldiers did not know that they had fathered children. And so that causes all sorts of other trauma. But this is a group that is they were discriminated against, called Children of the Dust in Vietnam, because they were reminders of, you are the child of the enemy. And then they come here to the United States, and many of them, they brought family members with them. They were the ticket to come to America, but then their families also dropped them or dumped them, like when they got here, because these children were dehumanized. And it's one of those, it's a really sad story. But within our communities, I wondered, but my parents never told me, because I would see half Vietnamese, half Black, part white, part Vietnamese people, like waves of refugees coming in, and it just became, you just assumed they were fathered by Americans during the war. And so this family, after 24 years, is reunited, and I think it's lovely that they have this moment where clearly they're affectionate with each other. I do wonder what happened to them. How are they doing today? Because when families are reunited after sometimes many, many years, there's drama, right? I mean, for many of us, there's drama even when we see our families every day. So I'd be curious to try to find out, where are they now and how are they doing? And then just scenes of everyday life are in the archive, and were captured by the newspapers. Like they loved going to weddings. Yeah, sure. So what we see here is, weddings. So we see a couple that get married here in Seattle. We see the couple in the middle. They also came to the U.S. as children in the 1980s, went to University of Washington, and now they're married and they're beginning their middle-class life. And the husband on the left ended up working for Boeing. And the wife on the right, I think, is also an engineer. So this is a photograph that was taken, I believe, in the early 1990s. And they settled in Bellevue. And then, couple on the right, the image you see there, it's a couple that have opened a little grocery store here in Seattle. So we start to, again, just see how they are rebuilding their lives. And another common theme in the archive and in this photo collection is reunions. Families who are being reunited. On the left, this is a man who came earlier than his wife and his child, and this is him greeting them at the airport. On the right, the woman who is in the foreground wearing the wool coat, she is someone who came early on, and here she is taking a new refugee family and showing them their new apartment in the Seattle area. And then on the bottom is a family that has arrived at different times, but they're finally reunited with each other. And it doesn't take much. You can see the expression on their faces that they're very emotional about this. So then we're into Act 3 and going beyond Vietnam. You've seen so much of what the Vietnamese experience that is in these archives, but also we see examples of other communities as well. The Lao, the Hmong, and the Cambodian primarily, which are refugees who came from these places that may not have been in the headlines all the time, but they very much were impacted by the war. The war was being fought on their land. Secret wars, not so secret wars. They each carry their own history of war and survival. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the stories that are in the archive. This is a Lao mother, and the caption also broke my heart. This is from December 17, 1981. A Laotian mother, Zua Lee, with her younger sons, Chow Hung, 4, left, and Yir Hung, 2, mourns Pao Hung, her 15-year-old son, who chose suicide over the rootlessness of refugee life in Seattle. I tried to do a search for this story, and I haven't been able to find it. I don't think I've looked hard enough, but that is heartbreaking. And it just, even then, even though we had these happy stories, there are examples of challenges within the community. And I think it's so important for us to dig deeper into that, because those stories are just as important as the stories of success. This is the Seychow family and their experience. Try to make this bigger so I can see. 15-member Seychow family, shown here, arrived in Seattle in early 1983. They had fled from the Vietnamese army in Laos in 1975, leaving the Mien village, where they were prosperous farmers, to walk for 15 days to Thailand. The family spent 6 years in Thai camps before being sponsored to come to Burien, Washington. There, the large family lived in 2 adjacent apartments. The adults studied English at Highline Community College, while the younger children attended school and the older children worked. The family patriarch, Phu Tong Seychow, was an accomplished musician and played several traditional Mien instruments. The Seychow family was photographed at their apartment in Burien and are identified as, and it's a series of names that follow. And you just wonder, it's like, can you imagine what these families went through before they came here? And I'm so curious what's happened in the years since. I don't know. And that is a part of, I think one of the questions that I have is, how do we find and locate these families? And some of that is probably building bridges to the Lao community here and trying to see, because I'm very curious. This is Mei Sung Seychow in Seattle on August 6th, 1981, wearing beautiful traditional clothing. And the caption in the archive says, Mien and Hmong women from Laos learn needlework at an early age and use their skills to make the traditional embroidered clothing and accessories worn by their people. The women continued to embroider while in refugee camps after fleeing Laos in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the Laotian Civil War, and after emigrating to the US. So they formed a cooperative here in Seattle, Southeast Asian Design, and the group showed their needlework at regional fairs and at the Wing Luke Museum. In August 1981, the Cicada Gallery in Seattle's International District held an exhibit of functional art, such as baby carriers, bags, and coverlets made by Seattle area Hmong and Mien women from Laos. So here, May Se Chow, one of the artists in the exhibit, wears the traditional embroidered clothing of the Mien people. The pants she is wearing took her a year to make. I mean, I would love to find that. And Michaela, we should let's put this into the exhibit. That'd be so cool. And I'll try to go through these a little faster so that we can sort of get to discussion here. But here's a family at a table in Bellevue. Also fled Laos, arrived in Washington in 1981. And these refugees are dining at the Bellevue home of their sponsors, Marilyn and Steve Brzezowski. They lived in the sponsors' home for 2 months before moving to their own apartment. And this is the Somvelev family arriving at the airport. And the words are too small for you to read, but it's like a crazy story. The family was living in a refugee camp in Thailand in 1980 when their 16-year-old daughter, Manachan, was kidnapped and brought to Bangkok. Manachan eventually escaped and returned to the camp, but her family had already emigrated to Seattle. The Somveleves learned their daughter was alive in late 1981, and the process to rescue her from the camp ended in January 1983 when she was reunited with her mother and brother at SeaTac Airport. And this is Yao Unaf Saturn farming near Woodinville on July 21st, 1982. And the Indo-Chinese Farm Project is something that apparently began in 1982 with 18 acres of land along the Sammamish River, funded in part by King County and the Pike Place Market Preservation and Development Authority. The Indo-Chinese Farm Project was a joint project of the Washington State Commission on Asian American Affairs and Bethany Presbyterian Church. Through the project, refugees from Laos, primarily Mien and Hmong farmers, could lease land for farming at low cost. In the spring of 1982, 16 families rented an acre apiece for $8 on land in Woodinville, owned by King County. They hoped to earn a living by selling their produce at markets and restaurants and churches. Some were able to pay their rent from their earnings, but many struggled with rent and food money in the first year of the project. It was not unusual for refugee families to go for months without food stamps or other aid because of language difficulties and lack of knowledge of how the process worked. Food banks were often closed by the time families returned to Seattle from a long day of work on the Woodinville farm. So this is a photo of Mien farmer Yao Unaf Saturn working on his plot of land in Woodinville. His family of 9 lived in a small central area apartment, and Saturn's wife could not help with the work due to health problems. At the time of an October 1982 article about the family, they were living on rice and vegetables from the farm and had taken out a loan for rent. Like many refugee families, they had lost federal assistance because of cutbacks and were worried about how they would make it through the winter. So we know he was going through the struggle, but we don't know what happened after this. But it made me think about when we go to Pike Place Market, who are the communities selling flowers to us? It's quite a few Hmong families, right? And it probably had its origins somewhere here with this assistance from the state and local organizations. And Futong and Soy Seili and Choi Seichao selling produce at Pike Place Market, Seattle, July 21st, 1982. The caption also again talks about the Indo-Chinese Farm Project that began in 1982. So here, Futong Soy Seili, who are Hmong on the left, and Choi Seichao, who is Mian, sell produce during their first harvest at Pike Place Market in Seattle. So then let's talk about the Hmong, because the Hmong also have their own story. They are a people whose historical homeland is in Southeast Asia and southern China. Hmong people came to Washington as refugees after the Vietnam War and the Laotian Civil War. Many were recruited by the US to fight in these conflicts and were forced to flee after the North Vietnamese victory in 1975. By 1982, about 8,000 Hmong had come to Washington and mostly settled in King County. This image shows a group of Hmong people waiting for a meeting about the end of a federal program which was to provide funding to assist refugees for 3 years after their arrival in the US. However, the federal government later cut the program to 18 months. I mean, I think we've cut it down to 0. Like, we're not even accepting refugees these days, and so it's context. This is Sao Yang at work in Discovery Park in Seattle in 1982. In September 82, a group of 12 Hmong youth refugees from Laos worked to maintain and build trails at Discovery Park under the federally funded Summer Youth Employment Program. Here, Sao Yang uses loppers to clear brush at Discovery Park. Don't know what happened. Sua Chung works on her farm near Woodinville in 1984. She wheels a tiller upside down after preparing the soil for a spinach crop. In the first year of the project in 1982, farmers had to till the land by hand, but the following year used rototillers donated by the Seattle Foundation. We also have our Cambodian community that is in the archive as well. And my neck hurts, so I'm going to have to look at my notes here. Okay, so here we see, this is an image of He Srey and Vuk Soth praying for fellow Cambodians in Seattle on January 6, 1985. And again, it's like containing information I did not know, because oftentimes I think people think of us, not just Vietnamese people as a monolith, but we think of Southeast Asians as a monolith. And the thing that caught my eye was that this caption tells us, during and after the brutal reign of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, an estimated 1 million Cambodians sought refuge in other countries. Over 130,000 eventually settled in the United States between 1975 and 1985, often after long periods spent in refugee camps in Thailand. Many Cambodians settled in Washington state, with the majority of those living in King County. As of 2019, over 18,000 Cambodians live in Seattle. Here, He Vray Left and Vuk Soth, both refugees from Cambodia, pray for Cambodians who have died at the hands of Vietnamese forces. They were taking part in a program at Sharples High School in Seattle, attended by about 250 Cambodians, which included speakers, prayers, and a collection of donations for Cambodian refugees. The Vietnamese troops had been mounting a major attack on Cambodian refugee camps on the Thailand border at the time. And so it's even the complexities among these Southeast Asian groups that we shouldn't overlook, and it's just remembering that each refugee comes with their own sort of struggle and their own history. And there are times when there's strength in numbers, and having the Asian community come together is really important to help out each other. But there are times that we have to recognize that even in this case, among the Vietnamese and Cambodians, neighbors, there's this conflict happening. And I think sometimes, I'm just kind of guilty of not really thinking about those little nuances, but I think that they do matter. Cambodian refugees. So we see Bunta Nep counseling the Tang family at the Asian Resettlement Center in Bellevue on June 14th, 1982. He's advising the family. He worked at the center as a counselor and had himself arrived in the US as a refugee from Cambodia. And this is one complete family. And this is something that I saw this and I felt like we always see history repeat itself, because even today, I personally have been involved in helping Afghan refugees. And it's interesting to see within that community over the last 4 years since the fall of Kabul, you have some of the first wave of Afghans, or the Afghans who were here before. They become the counselors who are working for the refugee resettlement agencies, who are giving advice to these new groups of Afghans who are coming in. And so it was no different for the Southeast Asian community. Each country had refugees from that place who would come here, and oftentimes this was their first job. It may not have been what they trained for in their homeland, but it was an accessible job for them, and if you had some English skills, you could do that work. And so we've seen a lot of immigrants and refugees rebuild their lives that way, in doing social work or humanitarian work, and then transitioning to other things. And then this is the Tongdu family. 18 months after the family arrived in the United States, they faced unemployment and the end of funding from the federal government. They were lent this plot of land in Snohomish County by an anonymous landowner who charged them no rent and agreed that the Thongdis would keep all income from crops and half the income from selling firewood in the first year. They planned to clear the land, sell firewood, and plant fruits and vegetables. Eventually, some family members planned to move onto the farmland. Pictured clockwise from the front are Deet Kama with the axe, Devath Un with the chainsaw, Lan Rama, Bunchan Un, and Kama Tongdi with the glasses. What happened to them? I'm very curious. It also speaks to, I think, just the generosity of people at the time too, which is really cool. Okay, Sarun Kong in science class at Rainier Beach High School in Seattle, April 25th, 1985. A lot of photos of, look at these amazing students in high school. They're doing so well after having come here under terrible circumstances. And here we see, again, two students who have come here, and they're good friends, and they're about to graduate from West Seattle High School. The two young women, so this was taken in 1989, and the two young women were among 60 Cambodian students graduating from Seattle high schools that year. At the time, the largest group of Cambodian students to graduate from Seattle's public schools. The Cambodian American Education Association threw a party for the group, awarding each an English dictionary. And just as I saw photos of Vietnamese weddings in the archive, we also have Cambodian weddings. And this is a couple who decided to go the traditional route and to have an arranged marriage. So the parents made the decision. I am very curious what happened. But the pictures are cool. And there's similarities. I mean, this is a Cambodian family and Cambodian rituals, but it's similar to Vietnamese rituals as well, where the groom's family comes as a group to the bride's family, bearing gifts, and they're in traditional outfits. And so now we come to the end, and the thing that I hope that we can break up and talk about and come together and discuss, as well as what's missing and what can we do as a community to reframe this archive. I think that, you know, we have a sense now very well of what Vietnam War refugees, what that means. That's what these images show us. They remind us that Seattle's Southeast Asian story was never singular. It was, and it still is, a mosaic of voices rebuilding side by side. And by the late 1970s and early 80s, the excitement of arrival, as you've seen, faded into the daily work of survival. We see refugee families trying to figure out how to make ends meet, how to pay their rent, learn English, and find jobs, often far below their qualifications. We see examples of organizations and anonymous donors who come together to create vocational programs so that refugees can earn steady wages. These are not glamorous images, but they do capture the quiet dignity of starting over. And with each wave that comes, clearly they carry very complicated identities, different traumas, but they also carry a message of hope and a hope for connection. And I think in a lot of ways, we're still trying to process this shared history with one another. For many people in the Southeast Asian community, it's still a struggle to survive and to get by day to day, which, and sometimes that gets transferred over to the children. And so, I mean, I personally have very deep concerns about intergenerational trauma. What did I inherit from my parents, even though I was born in the safety of St. Peter's Hospital in Olympia? What did I inherit from my parents that I may be inadvertently showcasing through my behaviors or through children, if that is in my future? I think these scenes remind us that resettlement, it isn't a single moment. It's an everyday act of endurance, repeated across thousands of kitchens, classrooms, and workplaces. The archive is powerful, but it's also partial. In MOHAI's photo files, we see these captions that often reduce complex lives to a few words. Vietnamese refugees at Camp Murray, that kind of thing, but no names, and oftentimes no stories from the refugees, more from the sponsors and the heroes, perspective. And sometimes we see misspelled names, and I suspect also even misidentifying some of their ethnicities and nationalities. There are folders that are labeled as miscellaneous, but inside you see a variety of these photos that are about these different groups, the Lao, the Cambodian, the Hmong. And maybe they deserve better indexing than just miscellaneous or other. And I think we have to think about what didn't survive and didn't make it into this collection, what may possibly have been discarded. So the fact that any of this has survived, it feels miraculous to me. But I don't think that survival is enough. Context is what really gives this meaning and teaches us, I think, a different way forward. Reframing the archive means more than adding captions. It means returning humanity to these images and inviting the people who were photographed or their descendants to finish the story. So that's where all of you in this room and many people who are not in this room, this is where you all come in. Where did I put this remote? Okay, questions, all right. Okay, all right. Sarana has a microphone, so if you have a question, please, a question or a comment maybe, raise your hand and we will bring the microphone to you. Any questions? Okay.
Thank you so much for This was on? Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I learned so much, and I think one of the things like we were talking about is that every single...
Microphone up.
How about
Okay.
this?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, and slower. Thank you. Got it, okay. When I think I was really struck by you're talking about the stories that were in the newspaper about the arrival, and then also jumping quickly to now everything's great. And I wondered if you had a sense of how those stories were being told in like the Vietnamese newspapers or local language newspapers. Was the same kind of phenomena happening, or was there more of a discussion and acknowledgement of the difficulties?
That's a great question. Thank you, Linda. Because I'm most familiar with the Vietnamese community and Vietnamese ethnic media, I can speak to that. I can't speak to the other communities. But there is mainstream media. I was in a household where my parents subscribed to The Olympian every single day. They watched the local news. We were a Como 4 family before it went to Sinclair. And we watched the news, Peter Jennings, every single night. So there was always that news. And very much for my dad, it was about, I need to see what's happening in his communism. Is today the day that communism falls, you know? And so they obviously looked to, we just had fewer options back then. It was like pre-internet. And so everybody was watching mainstream English language news. For Vietnamese media, it was a different ballgame for sure, because not only they needed, it was so hard to run newspapers and people needed a mix of advertising, community dollars, but primarily advertising in order to make their newspapers work. And many, many people had a dream of putting out a newspaper in Vietnamese language, and many, many of them failed. So I think we are down to 2 newspapers today, but no disrespect, but they really have no staff anymore. And they are really simple, very, very simple translations of existing stories and advertisements of local businesses. But my memory of growing up, my parents would devour, they would get the Vietnamese language news from the local Asian supermarket, or they would come up here to Seattle and pick up that paper. And the paper would tell them all sorts of stories that were about, you know, what was happening in Vietnam, what's happening in the world, what's happening locally, lots of ads of people looking for things, relationships, friends, missing loved ones. But the distinction that I would make for Vietnamese ethnic news media is we have always been burdened by this pressure to be anti-communist from the start. It's not enough to be fair and balanced, but it's almost, I am coming from a victim perspective, and if your newspaper, you are judged on how anti-communist are you from the get-go. And if you were not considered anti-communist enough, you're like the gentleman here who received death threats, right? So it was a very, it's a very traumatized, emotional community. And there's also, I mean, total rep sweat, right? Representation, like, was really, I think that was a challenge. And I applaud those who tried to report the truth and to get different perspectives out. But I think because of the level of trauma and what people had gone through, in order to even get here to the United States, it impacted how receptive they were to factual, intellectual truth versus emotional truth. This is my experience. If I don't see what's reflected in my experience, then I'm like opposed to you, you know? So that's been an ongoing struggle for Vietnamese language media, is our own self-judgment, our own civil disagreements, and this burden of having to prove that you are anti-communist.
Thanh, I'm Barbara, and I wonder how much of this is also intergenerational, how it changes from the first generation to the second American born and even third. And I know in other communities that that's a huge issue. That's actually not part of the archive, also something missing. But the point that you make of the newspaper opinions then must carry generationally, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, what I said about, I feel very privileged that I was born in America, I was educated, I'm a journalist by training, and so for me, I can look at all of this archive, look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and accept that all of these, we can have many truths at the same time, but that's my privilege, and that's me having not actually lived through a war, being emotionally driven to get on a boat and get out, you know? And so I don't have my parents' trauma, I don't have their experiences, and I think that that's something that I've learned from exploring, in a lot of respects, what the Jewish community has, how they have processed community memory following the Holocaust after World War II. It wasn't the exact generation that experienced the trauma that they weren't going out there and telling everyone their stories. It took 30, 40, 50 years, a Steven Spielberg film, to encourage people that even if you don't want to, you have to share what happened or else we're going to forget. Japanese Americans, I very much admire. In this very building, I've supported Densho, which does such an amazing job of preserving, and they have oral histories from people who went through the concentration camp experience. And it wasn't, and again, having gone to museums that reflect on that journey, the first generation that went through those camps did not want to talk about it. And in fact, they told their children, head down, do the work, and forget the past. And it was the children and their grandchildren who fought for reparations and who said this was an injustice. And you may not feel that you have the privilege, the tools, the power to say something and to speak truth to power, but we do, because we are also, we're Americans. And so that, I feel that I take a lot of inspiration from those two groups in particular, in the work that I'm doing now, with not just Vietnamese stories, but with Southeast Asian stories. And I hope I'm not the only one. We need more people to be interested in preserving these memories, because we are, and especially right now, I mean, I should take a moment to also thank MOHAI for this opportunity, because we're seeing our stories are actively being erased. So the fact that you're all here and that I can do this work at all is totally a gift, and I don't take that for granted. So I don't think I'm the only one, though. It's I just want to show people what's possible, and hopefully I'm not the last person who is curious about all these stories. Thank you. Anyone else want to share?
Hi there, I'm Jennifer, and I was wondering, and I apologize, I missed the very first part of your presentation, but is anyone else doing a Densho-like project where you're just capturing as many oral histories as possible before we lose that older generation? Are you familiar with anyone doing that?
I'm familiar with I've tried to be a part of grassroots efforts. 10 years ago, we had a project called Our Song, and it was a grassroots group of Vietnamese. We wanted to start oral history, collecting oral histories, but there are so many logistical challenges, and we all were trying to have professional lives and have families and, and all of that. And so you really need strong institutional backing in order to do that. But I actually wonder if Anna or even Michaela, if any of you have, are there groups and people, aside from Densho, are we seeing a movement of people who are trying to preserve stories from their communities?
Hi, I'm Ken. I run the oral history program at the Wing Luke Museum. And within our archives, we have a couple of big collections of oral histories, one of them talking about the early pioneering days from Chinatown, the CID. We have partnerships. We have partnerships with the Korean American Historical Society and our repository for many of their oral histories and materials. Kayla, help me out here. Who else do we have? There's the Filipino, Washington State Filipino Archive that we have portions of as well. There's a archive of Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander veteran stories. Gosh, we have quite a few little things, but these have come about mostly by other organizations partnering with us, approaching us and saying, hey, we've got all of these stories that we'd like to do something with, to preserve, to document, and hopefully catalog one day. As part of our regular doings, yeah, we have an oral history lab that's open to the public, where people can come in, get training on the equipment, get assistance from our staff, and record their own oral histories from, anything from like your uncle's favorite trip to Miami to, what happened during the first few days after 9/11 within your community. And we just completed a pretty big, I think there's about 60 interviews or something like that during the COVID lockdown about how it was impacting the CID, the Chinatown International District.
Thank you so much. And there are so many ways to preserve. I think people just don't know where to go. And so thank you so much for listing all of those resources. And a follow-up question that I have, maybe for you or maybe even for Anna, but it's one thing for museums to collect all of these oral histories. There's also the question of what do you then do with it? So it's like the act of gathering all of this is important, but the act of contextualizing it and actually how do you pull out the stories? That's a question. I mean, I'm just starting that journey, I feel like, for me, but I wonder if our experts in the room have thoughts on that. Yeah.
I see Michaela. So hi, I'm Anna Elam. I'm the Library Collections Manager at MOHAI, which means our Archive Special Collection. And we were so excited to work with Thanh on this project. So also I want to give her a round of applause for all the amazing research that she's done. I don't know that I call myself an expert, and I am trained as an archivist and librarian, so I am more on the side of collecting the materials, but we certainly do not collect them just to keep in storage. Our goal is to share them with our community, so we do that through things like our online collection, which Thanh mentioned. And I do want to say that I think Thanh asked me to speak to this a little bit, but please do know that our archive of all the materials that we have is open to everyone in our community. You are always welcome to reach out to us. You can just email us at library@mohai.org. You can ask us questions. If you see captions or photos or anything in our online collection that you have more information about, things that are wrong, that you find factually incorrect, that use terminology or terms that are no longer would be used today. We do a lot of work which we call reparative description, which is going back and looking at how things were described historically or in previous iterations of sharing materials, and do our best to update those captions, use terms that different communities and groups use themselves today. So please do feel free to reach out to us. You are always welcome to access the materials. So that's a huge portion of what we do, is we try to balance what we are collecting with our ability to share it with the public. It is a balance because obviously it takes a lot of labor and work, which is partly why we have things like the Curator's Fellow. So we bring in experts and people in our community who have a lot more knowledge than we do to help us find out more about our collections, bring to light stories that we have not yet been able to do so. and then we work and partner with other, I'm reluctant to call us experts, but of course we are to a certain degree, but our colleagues in other departments who do work in interpretation. And I think Michaela, my colleague who works in our exhibits, had her hand raised to speak to some of this, of how we share the stories. So, Sora, if you don't mind, I'll let Michaela take it from here.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to say a couple things. One is, we collect stories, like lots of people collect stories. StoryCorps did a project that was focused on Vietnamese American arrival stories. There's a lot of them I know, and I would love for you to talk and share what you've done. But one of the things that I think about when I'm doing an oral history project is like there has to be a piece of it where it gets shared back out. Like, we're turning memories into primary sources for future projects, but each project needs to have a piece where it gets shared back out. So this has been really a beautiful piece of yours, and I really am looking forward to tentatively working with you to create an exhibit where we can share some of these stories in a visual way with visitors, and think about how to represent the pieces that are missing, because I think that's a really powerful piece of the story. So would you please share about your...
Sure. Hi, I'm Ed Eckley. I think we spoke last year, and I work with Legacy Washington, which is part of the Washington State Archives under the Secretary of State's office, and we gather oral histories of folks that have impacted Washington State's political history. Often our projects are driven by significant anniversaries, and of course it's the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, and so this year we released a compilation of oral histories, published a compilation of oral histories from folks from all different ethnic and national backgrounds in Southeast Asia, from all over the state of Washington. And, oh, go ahead, yes. And I brought a copy for you, Don, but anyway.
I have a signed copy.
You do?
Yes, I do, because I support your work.
Thank you.
And yeah, we should give this as a prize to somebody who's here today.
Oh, but it's inscribed to you, so.
Oh, it is? Oh, okay. All right.
You can.
Oh, I'll take it. I'll take it. Thank you.
Very good. Well, anyway, but I did want to also. I met last year at a conference. Vietnamese Vote People .org is a national organization that is gathering these stories and turning them into podcasts. And so that's another one to check out. They're doing some amazing work and are looking for stories from all parts of the US and Canada. So thank you.
Thank you. Oh, also Ken has something to add as well. Oh, okay.
So kind of touching back to what you're talking about with the Vietnamese newspapers and having to show how anti-communist they were, prove their bona fides, right? Has that changed much since the 70s, like with the younger generations? Is there a little more acceptance of socialism, et cetera? And are there any lessons that we can learn from the community about how to, recapture some of the MAGA folks who seem to be the parallels between the two situations seem pretty intense.
Yeah. I'm embarrassed to say this, but Vietnamese American voter group is the most pro-Trump of all the Asian ethnic groups. I think Filipinos are second, but Vietnamese are the most likely to vote for Trump, most likely to vote GOP, and so much of this I think it's so complicated, the reasons why, and how we've gotten to this point. I have to call out Dee Dee Tran, who and we worked on a project called Viet Fact Check, co-founded this project in 2020 in the months leading up to the election to try to help our community by fact-checking information and making sure that information was going to be available in English and Vietnamese. And you can only do so much because it was so reactive. We can't fight the algorithms. We can't try to correct the record on every single piece of misinformation that gets out there and that truly influences people. So it's heartbreaking. And I mean, I'm very angry about the fact that people who have been through so much, their fears are being exploited in the current environment. And I think the only way back, this is just my personal opinion. My personal opinion is the only way back is to try to start rehumanizing one another, and again, recognizing, going back to history and reminding ourselves of these stories, who helped us when we came here. What responsibility do we have to the younger, generation? But it's also, when I talk about basic humanity, rehumanizing people, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I have a side hustle as a DJ, and I specifically collect and play music from pre-1975 Vietnam, because it's my own personal way of trying to understand, who are you? Who is this community that went through so much to come here, to be here, to give us the lives that we have today? What shaped who you are? Because somehow you must not feel, I worry that they don't feel seen and heard, or they felt ignored. And that has made many, not all, but many people susceptible to the strong man, who is telling them the things that sometimes they want to hear, but are not necessarily true or helpful, to them. So, and I do think that, yes, there is a generational difference with younger people. Again, the privilege of having been born in the United States, having been educated in the United States, and having been a journalist, for me, having been a journalist in mainstream, in local television news for different stations, for the Seattle Times, there was so much power and privilege in that my peers who work in ethnic media, frankly, do not have. And so I can understand the nuances. I am okay if there was an exhibit here with a photo of Ho Chi Minh, and you understand, you explain the context of why we see a picture of Ho Chi Minh, why we may see the flag of Vietnam over the last 50 years, the red flag with the yellow star, and not the yellow flag with the 3 red stripes. If you explain that context, I'm willing to be okay with that. I can see that there are different truths here. Unfortunately, for a different generation, we can't deny the suffering, and you have to empathize with what they went through. They will view a photo of Ho Chi Minh and the sight of that flag as a serious offense. I told Michaela, if we do something like this, let's not put the flag up, somebody's gonna smash the window, But there's an exhibit in Boston right now where this is an active controversy, where academics have a photo of Ho Chi Minh, and it's an exhibit about the costumes of South Vietnam during the war years. And the Vietnamese community there, particularly elders, and also young people who have been very influenced because of filial piety. We respect, we want to take care of our elders, we value and we respect their opinions. They want that picture gone, and they are boycotting this exhibit entirely because they don't believe that there should be any space or room for Ho Chi Minh, who in their eyes is an enemy to them. So I think, somehow we have to, it depends on the person, and it depends on the person's ability to be able to hold nuanced views and accept that different truths, to just accept different truths. It's not a me versus you, us versus them. And so it comes back to, I think, the importance of rehumanizing, understanding, why do you feel this way? What was your experience? And coming at it with compassion. And I've kind of stopped trying to change minds. I just don't think it's very, very difficult to change people's minds. And so I would say that this, and this younger generation, it's we are in a very weird spot, because a very real issue that our Vietnamese community and the Southeast Asian community is dealing with is mass deportations of people who have paid for their crimes. They've gone to prison. They've come out of prison. They are fine citizens. They're not doing anything wrong. And yet they are being deported back to these countries, such as Vietnam, such as Cambodia, and such as Laos, and places that they don't know. And it pains me to say that there are many in our community who are saying, well, you made the mistake, so It's like you were in America, you committed a crime, it's your fault, and they just can't, for whatever reason, don't have the knowledge or the capacity or the empathy to understand what leads people sometimes down these paths where they make mistakes and are human. And so I think it's just the reality of life is not black and white, and it's easier for some people to accept that than others. So it's a very long-winded answer, and it's not quite, but I do think that the younger generation, it's a little easier for us to be open to socialist, or pro-socialist viewpoints and leanings because of, the access that we've had to the language and to education. Okay, all right, it's late. You all should go home. So I'll stick around afterward if anyone has questions or advice for me as we start to think about next steps. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It means a lot that you would be here and that you're interested in meeting our fellow community members. And help me find them. Bye.